Our first presenter this afternoon is Nina Dudnik. Nina is founder and CEO of Seeding Labs, an NGO. She founded it to connect scientists in the developing world with state-of-the-art research tools and equipment, and to develop exchange programs that allow information to flow between scientists across the globe. She's got that globalist view of the world, not to hoard what we have and know, but to open it up and see how it flourishes worldwide. Seeding Labs has provided laboratory equipment and training to scientists in 17 countries around the world, from Ghana to the Philippines. She says, first-rate scientific talent is everywhere. So don't get too self-satisfied, Boston. Please welcome Nina Dudnik.
Thank you so much. Okay, so here we are in Boston, the home of revolutions, and I am here today to talk to incite you to revolution, to join me and Seeding Labs in sparking the next global scientific revolution. So why do we need another scientific revolution? Wasn't the first one sufficient? So let's think about that first scientific revolution. And this stretched from probably the late Renaissance through the 1700s. It gave us the kinds of tools that we use today that we've already heard about this morning, that we use to think about and understand the world around us and develop terrific new innovations and solutions. And it gave us such notables that we still think about today: Copernicus, Galileo, Isaac Newton, and even people from Boston. So roughly 300 years ago, 1721, people in Boston were not getting flu shots. They had a different worry. An epidemic of smallpox hit our city. The smallpox was terrifying. Nobody really understood it very well, and it had an incredibly high proportion of people who got infected died from it. And there was a particular individual, Dr. Zabdiel Boylston. He was a great uncle of the man for whom Boylston Street in Boston is named. And he read about this newfangled technique that had only been tried in Turkey, actually. Hadn't even been tried in Europe yet, and it was to use material from smallpox lesions from people who were infected to inoculate healthy people against the disease, and make sure that they could either not contract the disease or survive it if they did. And he tried it first on people in his own household, and then he tried a much larger experiment with a couple hundred people, and people in Boston were outraged. People thought he was trying to kill them. This was a terrible idea. This was terrifying. He hid in his house for 2 weeks while Bostonians roamed the streets carrying nooses, threatening to hang him if they caught him. It's hard to be a revolutionary sometimes. Fortunately, Dr. Boylston was a longstanding member of a larger community of people who could appreciate his work. And so they invited him to come present these research findings about his inoculation trials at the Royal Society of London. And the Royal Society was this first attempt at a Western collegial scientific society where people would come together, they would share their results, they would conduct experiments together. And what was remarkable about the Royal Society is in a time when travel and communication were still really hard, locally and especially globally, they were a global institution. The membership of the Royal Society extended from people like Dr. Boylston and Benjamin Franklin in America, all the way across Europe through René Descartes in France, Gottfried von Leibniz in Germany. Everyone was connected, and they were all sharing their results as scientists. And so it was sort of the first scientific social network of our modern history. And what happened was, ironically, they were very, very successful at propagating this idea of using science to understand the world around us. And so science moved away gradually from being the purview of gentlemen hobbyists funded by wealthy patrons to being something that moved into academia and to research institutions that were largely funded by governments. And so as time went on, the pursuit of science became kind of what we see and know today, very much tied in with national interests, national security, with national pride. And you can think of the epitome of this as the space race, right, between the United States and the Soviet Union, very tied into national interests. And of course, as a result, countries that could afford to invest heavily in science did, and countries that couldn't started to lag behind. And we've come to think of the scientific world a little bit like this. This is data from a couple of years ago from the World Bank. And the more dark red a country is, the higher percentage of scientists there are relative to the total population. So you can see this incredible north-south divide in the world of science. There are parts of the world where the World Bank isn't even sure there are scientists working. And in Boston, we might be a little guilty of this kind of myopia. This is a map that Mass Bio produces every year. You can see that beyond the boundaries of our state, no science exists at all, obviously. I mean, it's really just all here. So why is that a problem? You know, you might be asking yourself, this looks great, we've got it covered. We're doing all the best science here. Maybe there's just parts of the world that will not really pursue a lot of science, and we've got it covered. We've got this unbelievable wealth of intellectual capital. We're going to provide the solutions for everybody. I would argue that that is a terrible mistake. That would be a missed opportunity, because talent really is everywhere. And it is time to marshal the talent of everybody in the world to solve the kinds of problems that we're trying to solve today. And I'll give you an example. Cancer. Probably every single one of us in this room has been touched in some way personally by this disease. It's killing millions of people every single year. But what you might not realize is that actually the vast majority of those deaths from cancer are happening in low and middle income countries, in the developing world. Specifically, a country like Kenya, where an estimated 50 people per day are dying from cancer. So the Kenyan government actually declared this a national crisis a few years ago. And it sparked the attention of people like Dr. Mildred Nawiri. Mildred is a chemist working at a university in Kenya, and she's been working on the issue of malnutrition and micronutrient deficiency for years. So, as you might know, one of the top causes that's linked to incidences of cancer has to do with your diet and your nutrition and whether you're getting enough specific vitamins. And Mildred has this idea to harness the antioxidant properties of local indigenous vegetables, vegetables that don't grow here, they're indigenous to Kenya, and they're high in certain micronutrients, and she wants to use this as a food supplement to help all of us ward off cancer. Imagine if we didn't have access to Mildred's ideas, if she couldn't put those into practice. What are we losing when we lose the contributions of scientists like Mildred around the world? Because talent really is everywhere. And the problems that face us, like cancer, they don't respect boundaries drawn on a map, so why should our scientific community? And so this is why I started Seeding Labs, to really spark, here at home in Boston, use the resources that we have here to spark this global scientific revolution, to re-globalize the scientific community and make sure that that talent that is everywhere has the opportunity to succeed. What does it take? So I started Seeding Labs in the basement of a local university. I was a graduate student. I wasn't Bill Gates. I didn't have a vast sum of money, so what was I going to do about this problem? Well, I thought about what are the obstacles standing in the way of people like Mildred. And there are numerous, and many of them are really complex. Things like national and international policies. Some of them are surprisingly familiar to those of us who are scientists here, things like funding and access to good mentors. And one of them kept standing out, and it stands out in every conversation that I have with scientists everywhere in the world. And it's this idea of access to equipment. And so you say, well, it's a poor craftsman who blames his tools, right? If you have great ideas, what does it matter if you have the great equipment or not? But if you think about the last time you had a great idea, what if you had none of the resources to put it into action? Imagine how limiting that is, how discouraging that is. Over time, if you can't put your ideas into practice, you stop thinking them up in the first place. And it makes you feel less than your colleagues somewhere else. It means that people don't take your results very seriously because, well, you did them on old stuff and maybe your results aren't very reliable. And so it really limits your participation in this global dialogue and global contribution to knowledge. This was Mildred's lab the first time I visited her university, about 4 years ago. So no matter how familiar you are and how much time you spend looking at the interiors of research labs, you should be able to see that this does not look like a cutting-edge, highly mechanized research environment. And actually, this laboratory serves every single graduate student in this department. They all work in this lab together. And if you're trying to do the kind of work that Mildred is doing, you need a better set of research tools. And most specifically, the tool that Mildred overwhelmingly needed was this. This is an HPLC, liquid chromatography. It costs tens of thousands of dollars, And with it, she could analyze hundreds of samples in a week. But when I first met Mildred, she, like about a third of African scientists, actually had no funding for her research at all. And this is quite common. She was just starting out. And so how is she going to get into the game? She can't afford this device. She has no money to fund students or chemicals. And she's competing against US scientists who spend, on average, $80,000 or more a year just on equipment, not to mention supplies, chemicals, student stipends, the whole bang. This is what Mildred and her colleagues used. This is gravity flow column chromatography. It's about 200 years old as a technique, give or take, still works, but it's very, very slow. So in the course of a week, she could analyze 1, maybe 2 samples, while somebody doing similar research here would analyze hundreds. And so she falls farther and farther behind in that game. She cannot compete on an even playing field. But we have an advantage here. And like I said, I didn't have a lot of resources in addressing this issue, but I did have access to lab equipment. So why? Think about what you personally do every time you buy a new cell phone, or a new computer, even a new toaster. What do you do with the old one? You stick it in the basement. Maybe you sell it on Craigslist. Hopefully you don't throw it in the trash. You find some way to recycle it. Surprisingly, you are not very different from major research institutions, universities, and biotech companies. Because every time they buy new equipment, and they're at the cutting edge, and they absolutely should be, but all of that slightly old stuff gets put on shelves, it goes into basements, it ends up in storage somewhere, some of it gets resold, some of it gets sold for scrap metal. And so we have this unbelievable wealth of technology sitting right here in our very own basements, the exact same stuff that Mildred and her colleagues need. And so over the last 6 years, what I've done is built, with Seeding Labs, the world's largest arbitrage system for scientific equipment. Very sexy, I know. To take that surplus from our institutions here, connect it with that talent that is out there everywhere around the world, and use that equipment as a bridge to bring our two communities together. So we work with institutions all across Boston to delve into their basements and under their desks and to triage and catalog and collect all of that working lab equipment. Over the last 6 years, we've worked with over 40 different institutions, from Mass General Hospital through big biotech and pharma companies. And we've collected about 100,000 pounds worth of lab equipment. It's also a fantastic way for tapping into the global interests of our scientists here at home. And so scientists and scientific staff can volunteer their skills to put a little sweat equity in the building of labs of their colleagues in another part of the world. At the same time, we opened up a worldwide application process. We've gotten hundreds of applications from dozens of countries across the entire world. And we're finding this talent that really, truly is everywhere. These scientists are incredibly well trained. Most of them have advanced degrees. Many of them studied outside their home country here or across Europe. So they're already part of that global scientific community. We want to make sure that they can go home, have a productive career, train the next generation, and still be part of that global community. And they are training thousands of students. We're working with the university in Cameroon right now where they have 3,000 students in their biochemistry department. I do not think UMass Boston has 3,000 biochemistry majors. It's an enormous population of students out there ready for a hands-on scientific education. So this is what we do. We bring this equipment, we match it up specifically to the research that they're doing, the teaching that they're doing, and we ship it abroad. When lab equipment gets to the loading dock here, or at any of our universities or companies, it's routine. It happens a couple times a day. In fact, we're impatient. I ordered it yesterday, why isn't it here? When lab equipment arrives at some of these universities that we work with, it is an event you wouldn't believe. We have shipped, as of Friday actually, it'll be $2.1 million worth of equipment to 19 countries. And when it gets there, this is where it happened when the equipment arrived at Mildred's University in Kenya. It was met by 3 busloads of students and faculty in their lab coats. We drove it in a convoy up the main highway out of Nairobi, stopping traffic. It was met by the university president at the gates with the university flag and the university dance troupe. It was escorted into campus. Unloading that container was on the nightly news across Kenya. So talent is everywhere, and it is hungry to do science. 10,000 students are working in the labs that we have equipped this year alone. And every single one of them is going to go on to be a scientist or a doctor, a pharmacist, a teacher. So each one of these 10,000 students is going to go on to affect the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of people themselves. So the work that we're doing now is going to affect millions of people in the years to come. Together with their professors, they're doing incredible research with this equipment. They're producing results of a quality equal to be published in journal articles across the world, patentable discoveries. This is a picture of Ricardo Morbidoni and his research group in Rosario, Argentina. They developed a rapid diagnostic for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis that cut by 90% the amount of time it took to get a diagnosis. And the Argentinian Public Health Service tested this in the field. And as I said, that equipment it's not the end-all be-all, it's not the end of the story. And it's this great way to bridge communities, to bring scientists together. This is Mildred in the red dress again. She was part of a group of scientists that each summer we've brought to the Boston area. They've worked in labs here, they've met their colleagues here, they've learned new techniques, and those relationships have lasted across years. We've sent scientists from the Boston area back to Mildreds University as well. And 3 or 4 years later, they're still in touch, they're writing grants together, they've presented posters at national conferences. This is bringing the scientific community together. We're in a position now, unlike the Royal Society of London 400 years ago, where geographic distance doesn't make such a big difference to who you work with. It's just having that opportunity to meet each other. So this is Mildred. She came to Boston. She learned how to set up that HPLC. She went back home. She's teaching students and technicians in her department how to run that, how to calibrate it, how to troubleshoot it when things go wrong. And I can't say it any better than she said it herself. She felt like she had been redefined as a scientist. And this is what we're trying to do, and this is what I'm inviting all of you to join with us in doing, which is to redefine not just Mildred, but that entire map of global science, so that all of these tens of thousands of people around the world can really be part of this global conversation moving forward. So thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Nina Dudnik with Seeding
Labs.
Seeding Labs. Wow. You know, I didn't really get it. I mean, I get it intellectually, but when you show the photographs from Kenya of the celebration, when you bring this stuff in, and the TV crew's there and national news, and there you are, such a star, right in the middle.
Yeah. I do stand out a little in Kenya.
Well, that must feel great. In your ideal world, I mean, you sent $2 million worth. We know what scientific equipment costs. That sounds big, but also small. You know, what percentage of what could be going abroad, like if the great garage sale were just complete and everybody emptied their cellars and basements and all this stuff isn't ancient, how much more could be sent? I mean, are you scratching even, it must be just a tiny fraction of what could go.
I suspect it is. I've met, in 6 years of doing this, I've met one person who was actually measuring the amount of lab equipment his institution was throwing away. So I think it's unlike, you know, we've gotten to the point where we measure tin cans, we measure paper, how much we recycle. This is, oddly enough, still a waste stream that nobody measures. That $2 million is the used value of the equipment.
Yeah,
so new that would have cost something like that.
You should measure it like a drug bust, where it's always the maximum retail on the street, you know. Huh?
I'll keep that in mind.
That's probably 20 million, maybe 200. Okay, a couple of things. Yeah. Those, I don't know what at the Royal Society, I don't know what they thought when the hoi polloi showed up at the door and were clamoring themselves to do science, the rabble, you know, the we've got it covered attitude that you described there. Now, since we were the hoi polloi, generally speaking, that makes sense to us. But now we think about, I just want to test on this American attitude or first world attitude, however you want to describe it, now that we've got it covered. Do we really not? I mean, just let me, I know this is at the heart of what you're saying, and I don't mean to be disrespectful at all, but let me, you know, is there really some tapioca root in Kenya that's going to solve cancer? Or is this just a dream?
Well, if you look at a disease like malaria, which admittedly we don't get so much here anymore because we have air conditioning and nice screen doors and things like that. The first major drug against malaria was discovered from a tree bark in South America.
Quinine.
Quinine. Artemisinin, the most recent first-line drug against malaria, was developed from a plant in China. And so I've talked to a lot of scientists from Africa who say, well, clearly the next malarial drug is going to come from the next indigenous area, which is going to be somewhere in Africa.
So to presume that Indiana Jones is going to do this kind of racist.
I think it's unlikely it may come from a plant that's indigenous to Missouri, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but Indiana Jones went to Tibet, right?
Yes.
And everywhere else. I mean, the history, again, this is from this kind of royal imperial position. It was guys from Europe who
invaded
Darwin
the
and everybody
jungles
else.
and found,
yeah.
But it was Chinese scientists who discovered artemisinin.
Yes.
And so, 3,000 years ago, there were Chinese scientists doing research. We didn't necessarily know about them at the Royal Society 300 years ago. But imagine if they hadn't had the technological capacity to do that research now. And they've developed that in a different trajectory than those of us here in, say, Boston. That access to opportunity is really fundamental, I think, to everybody as a person. So part of it is that ability to have access to the opportunity to put your ambitions into practice.
Right.
But I do think scientifically, if you talk to different people from different backgrounds, they have such a different perspective on how they solve problems, the way they think about the solutions. But I would also say, especially, there are a lot of diseases that we just don't have that fundamental emotional drive to want to solve.
For that particular thing.
Right. We here, none of us except probably me, has had malaria before. Right. I personally feel great urgency about it, but that's because I've had it. If you have relatives who get it every year, if your kids are getting it, you feel such a greater urgency to try to solve that. Why would you deny somebody like that the opportunity to do just that?
Listen, I totally agree with you. I just wanted to test because you can imagine people thinking, well, we've got a lot of capacity. But while we have unleashed our id, let me ask this question.
There are enough problems out there in the world to be solved for all of us to work on.
Okay, but then let's take on this attitude. This, people look out at the world, they feel a little beleaguered today. Somebody's taking our manufacturing and somebody else is taking our call centers. And, we're in this Darwinian economic power struggle. And you'll just empower our competitors, Nina. What are you doing?
Yeah. Well,
all we have left is science.
Sorry?
All we have left is science, we're told.
Well, I'll say
and
first
talk
of all.
shows.
And cappuccinos.
Yep.
Don't forget that.
Yeah.
I'd say a couple things. One is that I want everybody to do science. I decided I was going to be a scientist at the ripe old age of 9. So far be it from me to not want local Bostonian students to actually have a hands-on science education as well. But, earlier our speaker right before lunch talked about how the fundamental model of how we think of universities is changing. The fundamental model of how we think of journalism is changing right before our eyes. Potentially this model of science where it's big and it's institutionalized and it's here and it's is also changing.
Will you give away our competitive edge?
Absolutely not.
Why not?
One, we're very far ahead. It's going to take a long time for our friends around the world to catch up.
Tell it to Detroit.
2, it only enriches us. And this is why I think it's so important for our science community here to take the lead in doing this. Because,
explain that.
So, for example, Mildred came here. She worked in a local pharmaceutical company. She and those scientists there, they are still in touch with each other. They're exchanging ideas. It raises all boats. It helps everybody come up with new ideas and move things forward. She has access to a wealth of indigenous plants, for example, that nobody here has access to. A lot of companies here are actually trying to get access to that, right? Rather than exploiting her in the sort of old colonialist model, right? This is a way to move forward.
No one loves so well, or have.
This was a way to move forward that raises everybody.
Listen, I totally agree with you, but you must get those responses because people are like, oh my God, what do we have left? Here's a Twitter question from the audience from Anne. Recycling lab equipment may not be sexy, but it matters to scientists in the developing world. There's first-hand testimony. And then this one from Nessa. Does seeding, your outfit, account for electricity access issues for this equipment? Once you get there, are you finding the infrastructure to support the equipment?
Yes. So that's one of the things we look for in the application process. It's one of the things we help people with is power transformation, getting converters, all of that.
Where's your next shipment going? What is it?
The next one is leaving the dock. It left our dock on Friday. It's going to Kenya. The one after that is going to Jamaica, Uruguay, and Cameroon.
What are you sending in there?
It's a 20-foot container of equipment that's going to Kenya this week. So everything that you can imagine, from petri dishes up through really sophisticated equipment.
That is really sexy. It's really real. I think it's just awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dudnik. Seating. Thank you very much. Just awesome. Fantastic.